To follow in the footsteps of Stuart Littlemore wasn't easy because he'd had his thumbprint on the show for the better part of 10 years, whatever it was. So it was very much his show. And he brought his unique, distinctive, acid style to everything. And for better or worse, I like to think it was for better, I wasn't Stuart Littlemore. So part of the difficulty is that remnants of his old team were still in place at Media Watch. So there was the new executive producer was a former Littlemore-y, and so were all the researchers and so on. So it was very much the sort of template of the show was sort of still set from his period. There was a bit of hostility that some rank outsider had come in and taken the gig, or been given the gig, and I think his former executive producer Salter was pretty steamed up about it, having this bloke from the print media come in and do it, who knew nothing about television and so on and so forth. I mean, he may have been quite right about that, but there was a few unpleasant moments, I think, initially when I started. Plus, there was a sort of formula to the Littlemore show that didn't necessarily sit neatly with me. So I suppose it took the better part of a year to break free of all of that, and that really changed when a new executive producer, a new team, and new researchers came in my second year in the saddle. Well, the role of Media Watch is as a critique of the media. That's what it does. Its other important role is to provide enormous entertainment and amusement for the people who work on and present the show. That's probably its main role. It's an enormous amount of fun doing it, but it is a critique show, sticking it into the media. Often media reptiles and other worthies would say, "Why don't you congratulate us for all the brilliant and wonderful things we do?" And I just say, well, that's not what a critique show does. It criticises.
Now, of course, one of the highlights in your time was Cash for Comment. What was Cash for Comment?
Cash for Comment was a whole subterranean world of opinions, views, messages, declamatory statements being offered to the public in exchange for money. In this specific instance, the ones that we looked at and nailed were the radio people, 2UE, John Laws and Alan Jones. But it was something very widespread in the media, and it took various forms. It was manifest in all sorts of ways. I mean, for instance, business journalists would be flown down to Melbourne by Telstra to cover the annual general meeting, and then be put up at hotels and given a night at the casino or whatever it was. I mean, they were all terribly compromised. People that wrote about computers and cars and travel. There was all sorts of, and even real estate, there was all sorts of subterranean arrangements that conceivably could affect the content, the editorial content, and about which the consumer of that content had a right to know what the commercial arrangement was. Do I think the listening public of Alan Jones and John Laws were being shortchanged? Yes, I mean, they weren't let in to the vital ingredient in the broadcast, that quite often these were not coming necessarily from the beliefs and the heart of the broadcaster, but were paid spruiking.
Now, I'll just take you to the very origins of the first story, which was when John Laws changed his tune on the banks.
Well, Anne Connolly had the gruelling and unfortunate job of having to monitor John Laws' broadcasts every morning, and this was quite a task, and probably emotionally destabilising to a reasonable person. But nonetheless, she did it very thoroughly, and she'd been noticing that Laws had been bashing up the banks big time, what rotten banks they are, and the poor little battler, and was not getting a fair deal out of the banks and all of this. So, that was a fair enough sort of expostulation to be taking, I suppose. And but then there was this magnificent flip that the head of the Bankers Association one morning rang Laws on air And Laws, in a very sort of oleaginous way, started sort of sucking up to this bloke and saying, "Oh, John, it's wonderful to have you on the radio, and yes, I'm sure we can work something out with, under better understanding of the banks and so on." And then there was the big flip. All of a sudden, Laws was all over the banks, and you had to, understand their position, and they were in a difficult circumstance quite often in relation to the public and their customers. So let's not be too critical. And that was the story, I think, that was done over a couple of episodes. That culminating in the flip, which of course wasn't the full story.
Then, of course, there was the leaked document that you received. That really was the big breaker, wasn't it? Can you talk about what happened?
Well, a week or two later, we received. I received a phone call from a friend of mine saying, "Look, that was all fantastic stuff about Laws and the banks, and you've really, done a great thing about showing how he's sort of changed gear on the banks. But it's not the full story. There's another bigger story." And I said, "Oh, well, yeah, what do you mean?" They said, "Well, let's have some lunch and we'll talk about it." We went out to lunch, and this document was produced at lunch, which was an agreement. It was, I think, one of the drafts of a series of there was a series of negotiations resulting in agreement, and it was one of those drafts resulting in the final agreement. But in fact, its terms were almost identical to the final, and in it, Laws was to be paid a fabulous sum of money per year if he, as the document said, reduced his criticism of the banks to 0 a week. So, of course, it was the cash register, and that made the difference. And it was then that the government of the time and the Broadcasting Tribunal got into the act. It just sort of kept unravelling. I mean, after a while, we were totally surprised at the number of clients that had Laws and Jones on the drip. The NRMA and any number of them, but it was absolutely rife, and the Americans had a variety of laws that stopped this payola type broadcasting, but we were very slow on the uptake about that. Professor Flint did go on the Laws program on 2UE while the Australian Broadcasting Authority was inquiring into Laws's behaviour, and Flint went on to spruik one of his manifestly magnificent causes, the monarchy, and he couldn't see any problem with this. I mean, most people were just completely horrified that the judicial officer, in a sense, was then going off to one of the parties for a favour and using one of the parties as leverage for another cause. It was just completely inconceivable. But the penny didn't drop for Flint for ages until there was a huge outcry. I think almost the entire legal profession was up in arms about this conflicted behaviour and so on. And he bowed out of the inquiry. Then was then conducted by Michael Gordon-Smith. Well, despite Laws and Jones' protestations that this was a non-story and that they'd behaved entirely honourably, it was a significant story for them because at the time, they lost quite a sizable amount of money each. I mean, a number of these clients peeled off. So they were disadvantaged financially. And Laws, in particular, did make a bit of a, sneering put down of the new regulations to reveal his commercial arrangements on air whenever he was spruiking someone. It just never ceases to amaze me why that would be a problem to not reveal that you've got a commercial consideration at stake when you say something. But anyway, that was what upset him. And yes, I mean, it was a big story in 1999. The powers that be at the Walkley Award Foundation, thought, well, these people deserve a gong, and myself, Deb Richards, and Anne Connolly, carted off the golden orb from the stage.
Just changing the subject, Mr. Begiki, he was the man that was found in the desert by current affair.
The Begiki story from my memory was the man who was lost in the desert for some days, and there was quite a big search on for him, and a lot of concern because he'd been missing for a while. And the Channel 9 helicopter found him and swooped down and landed. "Oh, Mr. McKeekey, we've found you." Instead of rushing to the aid of the poor dehydrated specimen that was staggering around under the blazing sun, they wanted him to reenact, his despair, his suffering, his dehydration, the complete horrors for the benefit of the current affair audience. So they set him up, they got the cameras rolling, and he had to perform, scramble through dry riverbeds looking for, bits of bark to chew on and, tussocks to munch, and it was just, it was just a wonderful instance of the sheer hypocrisy and shallowness of commercial current affairs shows, that this was all to be a performance. It was nothing to do with the rescue of someone that was actually in an extreme state of suffering. The significance of Safran taking Paxton to camp outside Ray Martin's house is, of course, a current affair. Had done this monumental job on the Paxtons and their family as a family of dole bludgers and not getting up and knocking back jobs that had been offered to them by the government and still collecting the dole and generally monstering them for being, un-Australian or something. I'm not quite sure why but that was what it was all about. So Safran was making this pilot for this TV show. He had one of the Paxton boys there with him outside Ray Martin's house, filming Ray Martin at the leisurely pace at which he went to work and going through Ray's rubbish bin. It was just a stroke of genius, the whole thing. Ray didn't take it well. Got very grim-faced about it and rang up Roger Grant at the ABC and told Roger Grant to pull Safran off his front lawn. It wasn't even his front lawn, it was the nature strip outside his magnificent villa in the lower North Shore. And again, it was just a perfect instance of the preciousness of these media presenters and so on, and how overweeningly self-important they are.
Media Watch, there's no other program apparently like it in the world. Why is it so unique?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Media Watch is relatively unique in certainly the Western world. I can't think of a comparable program. Why is it so important? I mean, look, all sorts of high-minded ideals have been invested in Media Watch as being the vanguard of true journalism and, setting a correct moral course for the rest of the, community of reptiles out there. I always worried about this sort of whole thing of handing down moral lectures to people. I never was comfortable with that. I mean, Littlemore did it brilliantly. He was that's what he was. But and others have done it brilliantly as well. Personally, I just had a different approach. But no, look, it's a valuable show and should go on forever. I mean, it's just as a little 15-minute show. In fact, I think it's 13 and a half minutes of going to air each week. But for anyone working on it can soon bugger up your life.